Good. Now I think we are live on all channels. So welcome. Welcome to today's meeting, everyone. Today we'll hear the fourth and final lecture in Professor Moore's lecture series, A History of the Infinite. I'm Sebastian Sunday-Grave, and I'll be very happy to be your host another time today. Before we begin, I'll say just a few words of introduction to welcome our speaker and panelists, and also to explain the format of today's meeting. Professor Moore is Professor of Philosophy and Lecturer in Philosophy at the University of Oxford and Tutorial Fellow of St. Hugh's College, Oxford. He is joint editor, together with Lucy O'Brien, of the famous philosophy journal Mind. And one of his most recent books is the third revised and expanded edition of The Infinite, published by Routledge in 2019. We are once again lucky too to have with us four more great scholars for our panel discussion after the lecture. With us tonight is Professor Han-Lin He, my colleague at Peking University. Hello. Professor Li Qilin, another colleague at Peking University. Professor Nan Xing, the third colleague at Peking University. And indeed, one more colleague from Peking University, Professor Zhao You, who has also been with us for the first lecture already. So welcome back, and warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for accepting the invitation. I'll introduce everyone in a few more words after the lecture, at the beginning of the panel discussion. And after that panel discussion, as in previous meetings, we will have an audience Q&A. So as in all previous meetings, we'll be collecting some comments and questions on the two live streams on Bilibili and on YouTube. And then we will present to Professor Moore as many of these during the meeting, and we will also share the rest of them with him afterwards. I would like to thank once again the institutions who have made this event possible with their generous support in the form of financial and other means. There's first and foremost Peking University, especially the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies and the Office of International Relations, as well as the Chinese Institute of Foreign Philosophy. Thanks very much to these institutions. In addition, I would also like to use this opportunity to thank all of the people at these different institutions who have worked very hard behind the scenes and also in the run-up to this lecture series. In particular, three student assistants, Zhang Yihui, Luo Shiman, and Zheng Xingfei, without whose excellent work this would not have been. So thank you all very much for your great work. Now, in previous lectures, Professor Moore has spoken to us about the infinite in ancient and medieval thought, the infinite in science and technology, and in the third lecture, the infinite in mathematics. During these first three lectures and during the discussion, the question of how human beings relate to the infinite has frequently come up. For example, if humans are essentially finite beings, as many think they are, then what understanding, or perhaps how much of an understanding of the infinite can humans reasonably expect to attain? These kinds of questions are amongst those that Professor Moore will address today in his final lecture. And after Professor Moore's lecture, which will, as before, last for about 1 hour, we'll have approximately another hour for discussion, starting with the panel discussion and the Q&A afterwards. Since this is the final lecture in the series, I also want to say, in case I forget to do so later, special thanks, many thanks to Professor Moore for sharing with us during these meetings so much of his insightful thought on the infinite and the history of thought concerning the infinite. Thank you very much. Many thanks, Adrian. It's been very inspiring. So now the title of Professor Moore's lecture tonight is Human Finitude. Welcome, Professor Moore.
Thank you, Sebastian. I'd like to begin in the same way that I've begun the previous lectures by echoing your thanks. Although, first of all, thanks to you personally for inviting me to give these lectures and for the expert way in which you've acted as host throughout all 4 lectures. But I also would like to echo your thanks to the various institutions that have helped to make this possible, and to the student helpers who have, sorry, you can probably hear my telephone in the background, I'll ignore that. Thanks also to the student helpers who have been working so well in the background. And of course, thanks to the various panelists who have had some excellent questions that they've posed after the lectures. So many thanks to everybody. Now I'm going to do what I've been doing in the 3 previous lectures, which is I'm going to begin by sharing my screen. And let me remind those of you that attended the previous lectures and explain to those of you that are perhaps attending for the first time, there's material on the handout in 2 different colors. Some of it is in black. If I scroll down, you'll see that there's also some material in red. And the difference between the 2 colors is simply that the material in red consists of quotations from other people, which I'll be reading out. The material in black is just my own summary of the main lines of argument. And as Sebastian has already indicated, my theme today is human finitude. So in a way, this is a complete shift of attention away from the infinite to the finite, although obviously there's a very intimate connection between the 2. And in particular, there's a connection between the 2 that affects us, human beings. It looks as if there's a profound sense in which we are finite. And so the question arises, what sort of grasp do we have of the infinite? And as you can see from the handout, I'm going to go back in time, not all the way back to the ancient Greeks, which is where we started in lecture 1, but back to what is known as the early modern period. So we're talking about the 17th century, and in the West, this is known as the beginning of the period of Enlightenment. And in particular, I want to go back as far as Descartes, famous philosopher and mathematician, René Descartes, who, as I say on the handout, was a paradigmatic Enlightenment philosopher who was interested in questions about what we could know, to what extent we had to rely on appeals to authority, and to what extent we could come to know things without appeals to authority, just using our own resources, using our own reason. So Descartes is a very famous philosopher, and many of you will be very familiar with his ideas. And there's far more in Descartes than I'm going to be able to focus on today. But in particular, Descartes was interested in the question of our understanding of the infinite. What understanding can we have of the infinite using our own finite resources? That's very much an Enlightenment kind of question. And in particular, he was keen to address this question, given that we don't have any direct experience of the infinite. It's not something that we encounter in experience. Our senses only ever deliver information about what's finite. And as I say on the handout, Descartes famously answered this question by saying, well, we do have an idea of the infinite, even though we don't have any experience of the infinite. This must have originated in something that was itself infinite. And in particular, this must have originated from God. And this was one of Descartes' basic arguments for the existence of God. Now, there's much more to be said about this, obviously, but before I say any more about it, let's proceed straight to some quotations which help to illustrate Descartes' thinking about these matters. So the first quotation is from a letter that Descartes wrote to a fellow philosopher, fellow thinker, Mersenne. And in this letter, Descartes wrote as follows, and I'll just read this out. It is possible to know that God is infinite and all-powerful, although our soul, being finite, cannot grasp or conceive him. In the same way, we can touch a mountain with our hands, but we cannot put our arms around it as we could put them around a tree. To grasp something is to embrace it in one's thought. To know something, it is sufficient to touch it with one's thought. Now, this is a very significant and very important quotation, because what this quotation does is it gives us an indication of what kind of insight Descartes thought we had into the infinite. He's clear that we have an idea of the infinite, as I've already explained, part of his project is to explain how we come by this idea of the infinite. But at the same time, he's equally clear that because we ourselves are only finite, there's a sense in which we can't really understand the infinite, and there's a sense in which we can't really grasp it. So on the one hand, we have this idea of the infinite, and on the other hand, it's an idea that seems to be beyond us. And the question arises, how exactly is Descartes going to resolve that tension? And he resolves that tension by invoking this analogy with a mountain. He says, look, it's a little bit like the fact that you could touch a mountain, although you can't embrace it. You can't get your arms all the way around it. And it's a little bit like that, says Descartes. We can touch the infinite with our minds, and in that sense have an idea of the infinite, but we can't fully grasp it. We can't fully understand it. So this means that, for example, we can know that there is an infinite being, God, but we can't fully understand what this means. We can't fully understand what this comes to. That's the important distinction that Descartes is getting at in this quotation. But the sheer fact that we can even touch the idea in the same way that we can touch a mountain with our hands still requires explanation. Where does this idea of the infinite come from? And that's the project which Descartes still sets himself, the project of trying to explain how we've come by this idea. And the second quotation that I'm going to be reading out to you summarizes Descartes' line of thought here. And famously, he argues that the only way in which we can have come by this idea of the infinite is because there is something really infinite out there which has left its mark on us, which has imprinted this idea in our minds. And that infinite thing is God. And this is Descartes' argument for the existence of God, or one of Descartes' arguments for the existence of God. So that line of argument is summarized in this second quotation. And this second quotation is from his third meditation. And Descartes writes as follows: I must consider whether there is anything in my idea of God which could not have originated in myself. So he has to rule out the possibility that he has somehow invented this idea himself, or that he has somehow conjured up this idea himself. And he now wants to investigate whether that could be the case. And he continues as follows: by the word God, I understand a substance that is infinite. All the attributes of this substance, such as supreme intelligence and supreme power, are such that the more carefully I concentrate on them, the less possible it seems to me that the idea I have of them could have originated from me alone. So it must be concluded that God necessarily exists. It is true that I have the idea of substance in me in virtue of the fact that I am a substance, but this would not account for my having the idea of an infinite substance when I am only finite, unless this idea proceeded from some substance which really was infinite. So there you have it. That's a sort of summary of Descartes' line of thinking there. The only possible explanation for where this idea has come from is that there is something that really is infinite that has implanted this idea in my mind. Now, before I go any further, let me note two things which I think are very important about Descartes' line of thought here. The first thing that I should emphasize probably goes without saying, but I shall say it anyway. Those of you that attended previous lectures of mine will remember that at various stages I've drawn a distinction between what I've sometimes called the mathematically infinite and what I've sometimes called the metaphysically infinite. So the mathematically infinite is a more quantitative notion, and that's defined in terms of ideas like endlessness and boundlessness and immeasurability. And that was very much the focus of lecture 3. The metaphysically infinite is the kind of infinite that theologians are likely to be talking about, the sort of infinite that attaches to God. And so the first thing that I want to emphasize is that we're now very definitely talking about the metaphysically infinite. Descartes did have things to say about the mathematically infinite as well, but that was a rather separate set of concerns for him. And what he's interested in here is the idea of a metaphysically infinite being, a perfect being that is completely self-sufficient and infinitely powerful, infinitely knowledgeable, infinitely good. So that's the first thing that needs to be emphasized. The second thing that needs to be emphasized, which isn't very clear from these quotations, but is very clear from other things that Descartes says, is that he believes that our idea of the infinite is more basic and more fundamental than our idea of the finite. And this is a question that has cropped up in previous lectures. I'm sorry to say that I can't remember who in particular posed this question, but one of the panelists did raise this issue after one of the previous lectures. Do we start off with an idea of the finite and then come by our idea of the infinite by negating it? Or is it perhaps the other way round? Fundamentally, we have an idea of the infinite and arrive at the idea of the finite by negating that. And it's an extremely important fact about Descartes' philosophy that he was definitely committed to the second of those two views. It's our idea of the infinite that's fundamental. and we arrive at the idea of the finite by negating that. And here you see him explaining why this fundamental idea of the infinite is there in the first place. Now, I think it's fair to say that very, very few people these days would accept Descartes' argument. There's a lot that you might think that you can disagree with in this argument. And I suspect that very few of you looking at this argument would want to agree with Descartes. Some of you might, but I would imagine that it's a tiny minority. Nevertheless, it's really interesting to note that variations of Descartes' argument do still have some currency. And the next quotation that I'm going to show you is a quotation from a contemporary philosopher, very famous contemporary philosopher, the American philosopher Thomas Nagel. And this is a quotation from a book of his, which appeared about 20 years ago, something like that, a book called The Last Word. And in that book, he writes as follows. So let me read out this quotation from Nagel. To get the idea of infinity, we must understand that the numbers we use to count things are merely the first part of a series that never ends. Though our direct acquaintance with and designation of specific numbers is extremely limited, we cannot make sense of it except by putting them and ourselves in the context of something larger, something whose existence is independent of our fragmentary experience of it. When we think about the finite activity of counting, we come to realize that it can only be understood as part of something infinite. Now, it seems to me that this is very striking because it seems to me that this is not a million miles removed from Descartes' argument. Here we have Thomas Nagel saying that the only way that we can really make sense of our finite experience of counting is by, and our sense of the possibility of counting without end, the only way that we can make sense of these things is by supposing that there really is such a thing as the infinite. And this, as I say, is strikingly close to what we've just seen Descartes arguing. There are some differences. There are some important differences. So one important difference is that, as I emphasized a little earlier, Descartes was talking about the metaphysically infinite. Nagel has now turned his attention back to the mathematically infinite. This is a mathematical understanding of the infinite that's at stake here. So this is certainly not Thomas Nagel arguing for the existence of God. That is something that Nagel would not want to do, and certainly would not want to do in these terms. So that's one difference. And another difference is that Descartes thinks that we have to invoke the infinite to explain how we have come by our idea of the infinite. Nagel thinks that we have to invoke the infinite in order to even make sense of our idea of the infinite, or the finite for that matter. So there are some differences, but there are some similarities as well. And I think it's just worth noting that that argument of Descartes, even though it probably seems very unappealing to most of you, does have echoes in 20th century philosophy. But let's go back to the early modern period, the 17th and 18th centuries. There's Descartes insisting that we have an idea of the infinite and insisting that we have to account for it and explain it. There were philosophers, and in particular the philosophers known as the empiricists, who were prepared to disagree with Descartes about whether we really have any idea of the infinite at all. So not only do they deny that this is something that requires the explanation that Descartes gave, they would even deny his starting point. They were prepared to say that we don't really have any idea of the infinite. And they were prepared to say this because we have no experience of the infinite. And because they were empiricists, they thought that we only really have any idea of what we have experience of. So here are the two of the most famous of the empiricists, Berkeley and Hume. Berkeley has already appeared in these lectures. Those of you that attended lecture 2 may remember that we looked at some of Berkeley's work because he had some fascinating things to say about the calculus. But he would also have wanted to deny that we had any idea of the infinite, either the infinitely big or the infinitely small. And as far as the infinitely small is concerned, here's a very interesting quotation from Berkeley, a very forthright quotation from Berkeley. He was prepared to say categorically, there is no such thing as the 10,000th part of an inch. So there is a limit to how small things can be. If you had a piece of wood that was exactly 1 inch long, you could start cutting it up. You could cut it into 2 pieces. You could cut it into 4 pieces. But there is a limit, and Berkeley doesn't think that you could cut it into 10,000 pieces. Now, let me say a little bit more about this quotation from Berkeley before we move on to Hume. One interesting thing about this quotation is that it looks as if it's in tension with geometry, because the kind of geometry that was accepted at the time when Berkeley was writing Euclidean geometry seems to presuppose that any line can be divided without limit. And most geometricians would have been prepared to say that any line can be divided without limit. And yet here's Berkeley telling us that there is a limit to how small an extension can be. So how did he reconcile what he wanted to say with the practice of geometricians? Well, he had an ingenious way of doing that. He thought he could make sense of what geometricians said when they talked about dividing lines without limit. And Berkeley's explanation was as follows. He thought that in effect, what they were doing was taking something that was only finitely long, like a line that's exactly 1 inch long, and treating it as a kind of representative of arbitrarily long lines. So you can talk about dividing this line into 10,000 parts, because that's really just imagining it as a representation of lines that get larger and larger and larger without limit. So if you had a line that was a mile long, you could divide it into 10,000 parts. And so this 1 inch line can represent that line that's a mile long. That was Berkeley's argument. That's quite an ingenious and fascinating argument. And what's particularly fascinating about it is that you get exactly the reverse in Aristotle. So you may remember from the first lecture, Aristotle was prepared to deny that there was a limit to how big anything could be. He thought that space itself was finite. And again, that seems to run counter to what geometricians want to say, because it's a standard claim of Euclidean geometry that any line can always be extended without limit. So Aristotle was in the similar sort of position to Berkeley, except it was the mirror image problem. He wanted to deny that there was a limit to how long a line could be, despite the fact that geometricians talked in those terms. And so he made the same sort of move as Berkeley, but he made it in reverse. He said that when geometricians are talking in those terms, it's because they're taking something that's finitely long and using it as a representative of lines that get smaller and smaller without limit. So Berkeley and Aristotle are making a very similar move in one respect, but in another respect, they're making moves that are the diametrical opposite of each other. Anyway, let's continue with the empiricists, and now let's look at what Hume had to say. This is Hume also denying that things can get smaller and smaller and smaller without limit. He thought there was such a thing as a kind of indivisible, smallest possible unit. And the way in which he tried to convince us of this was as follows. Hume said, put a spot of ink upon paper, fix your eyes upon that spot, and retire, that means move back, retire to such a distance that at last you lose sight of it. So if you back off far enough, eventually you're not going to be able to see this spot any longer. It is plain, says Hume, that the moment before it vanished, the image or impression was perfectly indivisible. It's not for want of rays of light striking our eyes that the minutest parts of distant bodies convey not any sensible impression, but because they are removed beyond that distance at which their impressions were reduced to a minimum and were incapable of further diminution. Now, this quotation from Hume uses old-fashioned English, and some of this English is quite difficult to follow, even for native English speakers. And some of you may find some of this wording a little bit alien. But the basic idea, I think, is quite simple, which is that Hume thinks that you've got this little spot of ink on a piece of paper, you back off, it eventually disappears, and he thinks there is such a thing as the last moment before it disappears, when you've got this tiny spot, the smallest possible thing that you can see, and then when you back off again, it finally disappears. Now, Kant, he's somebody else that has appeared in previous lectures. He's always playing the role of referee or the role of arbiter in these disputes. He comes after thinkers like Descartes, and he comes after the empiricists, Berkeley and Hume. And there's quite a lot that he wants to agree with in what they've all said. And what he wants to do is to try to work out how he can agree with them and try to reconcile some of their insights. So, as I say on the handout, he does agree with Descartes that we have an idea of the infinite, the metaphysically infinite, which is not derived from experience. He also thinks we have an idea of the mathematically infinite, by the way, so he would disagree with the empiricists about that. As far as the mathematically infinite is concerned, Descartes would just appeal to space and time, which he would have wanted to insist were infinite, mathematically infinite. And then he's got his own very distinctive story to tell about the nature of space and time, and why we have an idea of their infinitude. But he's also prepared to say that we have an idea of the metaphysically infinite, which isn't derived from experience. So as far as that goes, he's in agreement with Descartes. But he's also inclined to agree with the empiricists that this idea doesn't really give us any substantive knowledge, and he certainly doesn't want to echo Descartes' argument that God exists on the strength of this idea. So again, Descartes has his own story to tell about where this idea comes from. And Kant's view is that we have certain ideas from birth, if you like, innate ideas that are part of our basic mental faculty, in terms of which we view reality and in terms of which we understand reality. So we can understand the idea of God, and we might even have a belief in God, but Kant would not have wanted to agree with Descartes that we can know that God exists. We can put this idea to practical use. We can, as I say on the handout, we can have faith in the existence of an infinite God, and we can recognize infinite value or infinite worth in other human beings. And that was something that that Kant certainly wanted to say, that each human being has a kind of infinite value or a kind of infinite worth. So let's turn to some quotations from Kant to illustrate some of his thinking. The first quotation from Kant is from probably his most famous work, his Critique of Pure Reason. And this is an illustration of what he wanted to say about the mathematically infinite. And this is an echo of something that I've already talked about. This cropped up in the second lecture. Although he thought that space and time themselves were infinite, he didn't want to say that the physical world existing in space and time was infinite, because partly for empiricist reasons. To this extent, he's in line with the empiricists. He doesn't want to say such a thing because we can't have experience of a physical universe that's infinite, or for that matter, experience of a physical universe that's finite, because that would involve being able to see that it was surrounded by infinite empty space, or preceded by infinite empty time. And these are things that we can't have experience of either. So, as I indicated in the second lecture, he's prepared to say that the physical universe as a whole is neither infinite nor finite. And the way in which he tries to justify saying that is by denying that there's any such thing as the physical universe as a whole in the first place. So that comes out clearly in this first quotation. If the world as a whole existing in itself, if the world is a whole existing in itself, it is either finite or infinite, but both alternatives are false. It's therefore also false that the world, the sum of appearances, is a whole existing in itself. From this, it then follows that appearances in general are nothing outside our representations. Now, again, this is a quotation that uses rather strange and perhaps unfamiliar terminology to some of you. There's talk here of appearances and there's talk here of representations. But the basic idea is one of Kant's most fundamental ideas, that we have to think of physical reality as appearance rather than reality as it is in itself. What presents itself to us in experience is just how things appear, not how they really are. And in particular, that includes physical reality in Kant's view. And the very fact that we can't make sense of the physical universe as being either finite or infinite, he believes reinforces his view, because it means that we have to deny that the physical universe exists as a thing in itself, as a reality in itself. And the only alternative in Kant's view is that we have to think of it as mere appearance. So there's a kind of indirect argument here for his view of reality, physical reality, as mere appearance. But then there's also this idea that the metaphysically infinite is important as well, because we ourselves have a kind of infinitude. We're mathematically finite, we're limited in time and space. We obviously have spatial boundaries, and we obviously have temporal boundaries as well. Each of us was born at a particular moment, and each of us will die at a particular moment. But we have a kind of infinite worth, a sort of metaphysically infinite worth. And that's something that comes out in the next quotation from Kant. And this is a wonderful quotation. This is possibly the most famous quotation from all of Kant's work, actually. And this is a quotation from the end of his critique of practical reason. It's quite convoluted, but it is, as I say, it's very famous, and I think it's a wonderful quotation. And here's what Kant says. Two things fill the mind with ever newer and increasing admiration and awe, the more often and the more steadily they are reflected upon. The starry heaven above me and the moral law within me. The first, the starry heaven above me, begins at the place which I occupy in the external world of sense, and broadens the connection in which I stand into the unsurveyable magnitude of worlds beyond worlds and systems of systems. The second, the moral law, begins at my invisible self, my personality, and depicts me in a world which has true infinity. The first view of a countless multitude of worlds annihilates, as it were, my importance as that of an animal creature, which must give back to the planet a mere speck in the universe, the matter of which it was formed, after it has been provided for a short time, we know not how, with vital power. The second, on the other hand, infinitely raises my worth as that of an intelligence by my personality, in which a designation is assigned to my existence by the moral law, a destination which is not restricted to the conditions and limits of this life, but reaches into the infinite. So there's a lot going on in that quotation, but you get the main idea that mathematically we're finite and insignificant, tiny little creatures on a tiny little planet in the corner of the universe. But metaphysically, we are of infinite value. And as you can see in this quotation, Kant wants to connect that to what he calls the moral law. Our infinite worth is bound up with this fundamental distinction that he wants to draw between what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. And the moral law is partly a matter of just respecting our own infinite value. So, what I've done so far is go back to what I was calling the early modern period, the 17th and 18th centuries, and we've seen the various different things that philosophers from that period wanted to say. And in particular, the various things that they wanted to say about our idea of the infinite and how we come by it. In the rest of today's lecture, I want to look at some broader questions about our finitude, and in particular, our temporal finitude. We each have a beginning in time, and we each have an end in time. So we were born and we will die. Now, people have all sorts of different views about what is entailed beyond that. Is there some kind of afterlife? Will we carry on existing in another world? Will we in some way exist outside time, or do we in some way exist outside time, as well as existing in this world of space and time? So these are some very basic questions that people have debated for thousands of years. But there's not only the question of what it is like, there's the question of what we would want it to be like. If you had the choice, if somebody presented you with an elixir of life that enabled you to carry on living forever in this world, let's say, so that you could be temporally infinite, never dying, but continuing to live forever in this space and time in pretty much the same sort of way that you do now. Is that an attractive prospect? Is that something that you would choose? Some philosophers, as I say on the handout, are indifferent to this. They have no preference one way or the other. Some philosophers celebrate the fact that we're mortal. They would not want to live forever. Some philosophers lament the fact that we're mortal and would want to live forever. And if they were given the chance, if they were given the elixir of life, they would take it. So you find all sorts of different attitudes, and you find these differences of view throughout the history of thought about infinity. And what I want to do now is just present you with a series of quotations from philosophers who have reacted very differently to this question. So first of all, we go back to the Greek philosopher Epicurus, and he lived in the 4th and 3rd century BC. And this first quotation is from a letter that Epicurus wrote to Minucius. And he writes as follows: that most frightful of evils, death, he calls it that most frightful of evils because that's what other people have wanted to say about it. That most frightful of evils, death, is nothing to us, seeing that when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist. Thus, it is nothing either to the living or to the dead, The former do not have it, the latter no longer exist. So Epicurus was quite nonchalant about death. I mean, basically his thought was, well, okay, eventually I'm going to die, but that's no problem because by the time I'm dead, I won't exist any longer. So that's not a misfortune for me. That's not something that I need to treat with any kind of fear or dread. So Epicurus was of the view that we don't need to think of death as that most frightful of evils. And then later, this is in the 1st century BC, we get the philosopher Lucretius, who was a follower of Epicurus. He was an Epicurean, and he wanted to defend Epicurus's ideas. And so he agreed in particular that we shouldn't fear death. And one way in which Lucretius tried to argue for this was by saying, well, look, what awaits us after death is no different really from what was going on before we were born. So here's the quotation from Lucretius. Look back again to see how the ending expanse of past time before we were born has been nothing to us. For nature holds this forth to us as a mirror image of the time to come after our death. Is there anything terrible there? Does anything seem gloomy? Is it not more peaceful than any sleep? So Lucretius's basic thought is, look, you don't mind the fact that there were millions and millions of years in the past when you didn't exist. That's not something that you're worried about. So why should you be worried about the fact that there will be millions and millions of years in the future when you will no longer exist? We should take the same attitude towards time after our death as we do towards time before our birth. That's Lucretius's argument, and it's a very simple argument, but it's a very powerful argument. And then much, much more recently, we get the 20th century philosopher Bernard Williams, who wrote a famous article on these issues in which he agreed with Epicurus and Lucretius that we shouldn't lament the fact that we're mortal. And indeed, Bernard Williams argues it would be awful if we were immortal, if we did live forever. And Bernard Williams writes as follows: an eternal life would be unlivable. I would eventually have had too much of myself. There are good reasons, surely, for dying before that happens. And what Bernard Williams does in his article is he argues that if we did live forever, eventually it would just become incredibly tedious. Eventually we would reach the point that we couldn't stand it any longer. Or at least that would be true unless there was so much variety in our lives that after a while you would have to query whether you were still the same person or not. So basically, Williams presents us with a kind of dilemma. If we were going to live forever, either there would have to be enough variety to make it a life worth living, but then there would be a question about whether it was one person's life. Or there would have to be enough constancy to make it clear that it was one person's life. But then there would be a question about whether it was worth living, because then there would be so much monotony that eventually it would be tedious to the point that you couldn't bear it any longer. Now, before I finish talking about Bernard Williams, I just want to say a little bit more about his article. And in particular, I want to mention its title. The title of Bernard Williams's article, from which this quotation is taken, is The Macropolis Case. And it gets its title from a play written by a Czech playwright called The Macropolis Case. And this play was turned into an opera by the composer Janacek, called The Macropolis Case. And Bernard Williams uses this as his title because the Macropolis Case concerns a woman named Alina Macropolis. And she is somebody who has taken an elixir of life that stops her from dying. And when the action takes place, she is 350 years old. She's been alive for 350 years. But already she has reached the point that she can't stand it any longer. And in fact, what happens at the end of the play and at the end of the opera is that she chooses not to take the elixir again. She has to keep taking it if she's going to carry on living forever. She chooses not to take it again. She would prefer to die. And that's why Williams is so interested in this opera and why it relates to his article. And that's why he used the name of the opera as the name for his article, because he thinks that what happens to Alina Macropolis is something that would happen to everybody eventually. But not everybody agrees. There are philosophers who take very much the opposite view, and that's why it's still a live debate. And so here are two quotations from recent philosophers, 20th century philosophers, who take the opposite view from Bernard Williams. So first of all, we have this Spanish thinker, Miguel de Unamuno, who wrote a book called The Tragic Sense of Life. And there's the following quotation that occurs in that book. He writes as follows: "For myself, I can say that as a youth, and even as a child, I remained unmoved when shown the most moving pictures of hell. For even then, nothing appeared quite so horrible to me as nothingness itself." So he was really terrified of the idea that he might eventually cease to exist. He thought that that really would be terrible. So that's exactly the opposite line of thought from what we saw in Epicurus. He's prepared to say that there's nothing quite so horrible as nothingness itself. He would rather carry on existing in hell than stop existing altogether. And then Nagel, again, we had a quotation from Nagel earlier, the American philosopher Nagel. But here's another quotation from Nagel. This is from his book, The View from Nowhere. And he's directly opposing Williams. One of the people that he talks about in that book is Bernard Williams. And here he is presenting his opposite view. Because Nagel says that he would choose to live forever if he could, provided that all else was equal. I mean, obviously, there could be circumstances in which you would choose to die because you were in excruciating pain, for example, and there was reason to suppose that you could never remedy this, that there was no way of stopping the pain. So here's the quotation from Thomas Nagel. I believe that there is little to be said for death. It is a great curse, and if we truly face it, nothing can make it palatable except the knowledge that by dying we can prevent an even greater evil. So, for example, you might choose to die, as I said, because the alternative would be excruciating pain. Or you might choose to die for altruistic reasons. There may be some situation in which you could save other people's lives by sacrificing your own life. But otherwise, and this is how the quotation continues, otherwise, given the simple choice between living for another week and dying in 5 minutes, I would always choose to live for another week. I conclude that I would be glad to live forever, says Thomas Nagel. So that's in opposition to Williams. That's the opposite conclusion from Williams's conclusion. Now, I myself think that there's a problem with Nagel's argument, and we can come back to this in the Q&A if people would like to, but let me briefly just say something about why I would want to resist the argument from Nagel in this quotation. I think there is good reason to imagine that somebody would choose to be finite, mortal, if they had the choice. They might think that it's only if you're mortal that your life has any meaning or any urgency about it. So given the choice between living forever and being mortal, somebody might say, well, my preference would be to be mortal. That might be the choice that they make. Nevertheless, given the choice between living for another week and dying in 5 minutes, they might always choose to live for another week. So as it were, you could think, look, it's better if I'm mortal, but I don't want these to be my last 5 minutes. Every time the question arises, okay, are you prepared to go now? You might always say, oh no, not just yet. I'd rather have another week, please. So in other words, I don't think that Nagel is entitled to draw the conclusion that he draws there. So there's disagreement. Those quotations illustrate striking disagreement between philosophers who celebrate our mortality and philosophers who lament it. But as I say on the handout, there does seem to be consensus on one point. The sheer fact that we will one day die doesn't seem to mean that our lives are meaningless. Some people have thought that it does mean that, but the thinkers that we've been looking at in today's lecture are all agreed that that's not the case. And you might even say, you know, the sheer fact that we recognize ourselves as finite produces what, as I say on the handout, has been called the restlessness of the human heart, a constant desire to reach out for more. So very briefly, I'm almost finished, but very briefly, I want to look at the question where that leaves us and what kind of grasp we have of the infinite. And of course, we still have that basic distinction between the mathematically infinite and the metaphysically infinite. And perhaps we want to give different answers in the two cases. So Wittgenstein is a clear example of somebody who doesn't think, at least as far as the mathematically infinite is concerned, doesn't think that there's much of an issue here. Wittgenstein would say, look, we talk about the infinite in mathematics quite comfortably because it's just all part of the calculus. It's part of our training to discuss the infinite in various ways, and we can make sense of that in terms of what we do with finite symbols, how we manipulate them, how we reason with them, how we draw conclusions with them. So in particular, as you can see in this quotation, he has something to say about the expression "and so on." And that expression is important because we often use that expression when we're talking about the infinite. I myself have quite often done that. When I've been talking about the natural numbers, I've quite often said things like 1, 2, 3, and so on, or maybe 1, 2, 3, etc., and so on are two ways of capturing the same idea. And what that expression is supposed to indicate is that we're talking about a series that goes on forever. There is no such thing as the biggest natural number. And what does Wittgenstein want to say about this? Well, here's what he has to say. The expression "and so on" is nothing but the expression "and so on." Nothing, that is, but a sign in a calculus, which can't do more than have meaning via the rules that hold of it. That is to say, the expression "and so on" doesn't harbor a secret power by which the series is continued without being continued. So we're tempted to think that there's this kind of never-ending sequence that goes on forever and ever in a way that we can't really grasp. But Wittgenstein says, no, it's much more simple than that. We can grasp it. We can use the expression "and so on." That's what we do. That's how you explain the infinitude of the natural numbers. 1, 2, 3, and so on. And that's fine. That makes perfectly good sense. It's part of what we've been trained to do. And we know how to use that sign, and we know how to do mathematics with the natural numbers. Now, I myself think, I haven't argued for this, and we can perhaps come back to this in the Q&A. I myself think that it is our grasp of the finite, and in particular our grasp of our own finitude, that is fundamental to what grasp we have of the infinite, certainly if we're thinking of the infinite in a metaphysical sense. So in other words, I would be prepared to say the exact opposite of Descartes. So right at the beginning of today's lecture, I emphasized that for Descartes, the idea of the infinite is more fundamental than the idea of the finite. I think it's the other way around. I think our idea of the finite is more fundamental. But there's a fundamental paradox, and that's what I want to conclude with today. We do have a grasp of finitude. We have a grasp of our own finitude, and that gives us whatever sense we have of the infinite. But of course, it also makes us think that we can't really grasp the infinite. So this is in line with what Descartes said. I just disagreed with Descartes, but now I'm inclined to agree with him. It is a little bit like the mountain. We can sort of touch it, but we can't grasp it. So we sort of think that we know what the infinite is, and we sort of think that we don't know what the infinite is. How on earth are we finally going to resolve this paradox? Well, I quite like what Iris Murdoch says about this. She's a 20th century philosopher as well as a famous novelist. And what she says is, look, we do have this sense of the infinite as something which is beyond our grasp, as something which is so great that we can't possibly understand it. And she does the exact opposite of Descartes. What Descartes did was to argue from this for the existence of God. What Murdoch does is to argue from this to the non-existence of God. So she says, look, the infinite is so great that it's, as it were, it's too great for mere existence. No merely existing thing could be what we have meant by God. Any existing God would be less than God. God does not and cannot exist. That's Iris Murdoch's view. Now, I wouldn't want to put it in quite such stark terms as that, but I can see what she's getting at. But, and then this is the thing that I am really very much inclined to agree with, whatever we may or may not say about God, whether we believe in God or not, whether we're theists or atheists or agnostics, whatever we might want to say about that, the fact is that we do have this idea of God. And Murdoch says what led us to conceive of him does exist and is constantly experienced and pictured. It's an idea that plays an important role in our lives. It is incarnate in work and knowledge and love. So whether there's anything corresponding to this idea is an open question. Descartes argued that there was. Murdoch argues that there isn't. Whether there's anything that's metaphysically infinite or not, whether God exists or not, we do have the idea. And the idea is important, and Murdoch would be the first to emphasize its importance. And I would agree with Murdoch. I would also want to emphasize its importance. So I've gone on well over the hour, I'm afraid. So that's a very, very good point at which I should stop.
Thank you ever so much, Adrian. Many thanks to Professor Moore for this fourth lecture. And I think that was indeed the perfect point to stop, not only given time, and I think that we still have plenty of it to discuss, but also I thought Iris Murdoch was a great finishing quotation to discuss and introduce today. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists in a little bit more detail, as I said, before we begin the discussion. And I will introduce the first two panelists. First, because we have decided to try a different format today. Today, we will have two of our panelists share some of their comments, then Professor Moore will respond, and then the other two panelists will share some of their comments and Professor Moore will respond. So we will begin with Professor Han Lin-He, and Professor Nan Singh. And so I will introduce those two briefly before they can share their comments, beginning with Professor Han. Professor Han is back today. He was with us also at the last lecture, of course. Professor Han Lin-He is Changjiang Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Peking University. And he is also a member of the Chinese Institute of Foreign Philosophy. His main research interests are in early analytic philosophy, metaphysics, philosophy of mind and language, Taoist philosophy, and comparative philosophy. And he has published many influential books and articles in all of these areas, including books on logic, metaphysics, Chomsky, Wittgenstein, the Zhuangzi, and Guoxiang. In 2019, he published a new comprehensive translation of Wittgenstein's collected works in 8 volumes, and he is currently preparing a new translation of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Welcome back, Professor Han.
Thank you.
Now I will briefly introduce also Professor Nan Singh of Peking University. Now, Professor Nan Singh has studied philosophy in Beijing, Berlin, and Munich, and now he teaches philosophy at Peking University. He has a wide range of interest in the history of modern philosophy. His academic publications are mainly about Kant, In recent years, he has also become very interested in the implications of new technologies, especially AI, for various fundamental concepts and problems in philosophy. Welcome, Professor Nan.
Thank you.
I think that Professor Han will begin. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your introduction. Thanks for Professor Moore's lectures. I want to raise some question related to your distinction between metaphysically infinite and mathematically infinite. You seem to think that there is such we can find such a distinction in Kant. So in some paragraph of your book about the infinite, it seems to me that you regard the metaphysically infinite as the physical world or the natural world as a whole. But in other parts, you seem to regard the metaphysically infinite as nominal world or intelligible world. So I'm wondering what's the connection between the two positions, different positions. So could you give us some explanation about this? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Han. Now, Professor Nansing will present his comment before Professor Moore will respond.
Okay, thank you for your wonderful talk. Actually, I have followed almost all previous talks, but not the last one because of some technical problem. And anyway, I have followed all of them, tried to follow all of them, and I find very interesting. And there are many interesting issues that I want to explore, but of course, I cannot talk about all of them here. So I'll just concentrate on 2 points, one question and one comment. The question actually has much in common to do with what Professor Hanninger just have said. That's about the meaning of the infinite, especially the distinction between mathematically and metaphysically infinite. And from your talk, and we found that the notion of infinite has been used in too many different contexts, and it shows too many different meanings. And in some sense, I think in the Western tradition of metaphysics, actually the so-called mathematically and metaphysically infinite are intrinsically connected with each other. They cannot be separated. For example, the early modern philosophers, Leibniz, you have mentioned in the last or the second lecture, but actually from Descartes, they think that the essence of corporeal substance of body is the infinity divisibility, and this, of course, this is a metaphysical concept because they determine the very essence of the material or corporeal substance. But their criteria or I should say the meaning they used to describe the divisibility is a mathematical one, and the notion of it becomes clear only afterwards with further development of mathematical. So I think even in the metaphysical tradition, the notion of infinity is used in too many different ways, and both of them, all of them, are very important. So I think we really need to get more clear about these different notions. That's one point. And also another point that is about another context when we talk about the infinite value, or in this sense. So in the talk you just present, you have mentioned that Kant believe that a person have an infinite value, I think it's perhaps not Kant's his own expression, because as far as I know, Kant just said that human beings are of an unqualified value. He called it as the so-called dignity, Würde, as in contrast to the notion of price. So he thinks that the Würde, the dignity, is cannot be exchanged with other price, and that's what's possessed by each person. But I think he would not think that dignity is something of infinity, because infinity for Kant, and as Professor Han and actually as your presentation have already showed us, that is a predicate of the universe, of the cosmos as a whole, or perhaps also as a predicate of God. But I don't think he would think that the person, although they have a peculiar dignity, they would not be infinite. So perhaps there is also a distinction that needs to be made, and that's my second point. And lastly, that there's a comments. So from at the end of the talk, you talked about the mortality and the infinity, and I think these are very, very interesting questions, not only to academic philosophers, but to everyone and to many Chinese people, not just to Western people. And in the history of Chinese thought, I think we have many ideas about the infinite and finitude of human life. And the most impressive one for me is a very, very famous essay written by a great poet in the Song Dynasty called Su Shi. He writes. I'm sorry, I cannot present the idea of his idea in this, but he is not alone, and the main idea to the essence is that, of course, we want to transcend our finitude, but how can we do it? And that's by identifying ourselves with the nature as a whole. So the Chinese conception of nature is not the same as the Western, or to be more precise, the Chinese conception of nature is not the same as the Kantian one, as the sum of the rule-governed or law-governed appearances, or as the Baconian one as the object to be conquered, to be used. The Chinese notion of nature is, I think, much the mainstream idea is much similar to the romantic conception of nature. So the Chinese people, many Chinese people think that if we identify ourselves with the nature as a whole, if we see ourselves as harmonious with all of nature, then we can transcend our finitude. And this, I think, does not involve the idea of infinite typically in Western thought, which is necessarily connected with the idea of God as your last quote, and first as your first and last quote, and many other works showed. So that's just a comment. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So now Professor Moore will respond.
Good. Well, thanks. And I'm really glad that we paired these two questions, because obviously there's some clear connections there, and it will be useful for me to respond to Han Linhu and to Nansing at the same time. For various reasons, I'm inclined to answer these questions in reverse order, actually. I think you may see the rationale for that once I start. But in particular, I want to start by responding to the very last point, which is this is exactly what I was hoping would happen, that you would expose me to some ideas from Eastern thought and give me the opportunity to see some of the connections and contrasts that there might be. My focus throughout all 4 of these lectures has been on Western thought, and that was something that I tried to emphasize right at the very beginning. But of course, I'm really interested to see what connections there might be with Eastern thought as well, and there's plenty there that it would be interesting for me to go away and investigate further. But both of you raised the questions about the distinction between the metaphysically infinite and the mathematically infinite. And both of you specifically connected it to Kant. So I think perhaps to say a little bit more than I have said about the distinction itself, and then also to say some more about how it manifests itself in Kant. I haven't been very precise about the distinction, not only in these 4 lectures, but in anything that I've ever written about this. And that's in a way deliberate. I mean, I don't want to be precise about this distinction. It's deliberately meant to be a vague one, partly because I think if I tried to give precise definitions of what I understand by the metaphysically infinite and what I understand by the mathematically infinite, that would itself risk being a kind of violation of the very idea, certainly in the case of the metaphysically infinite. I mean, part of our conception here is that it's something that can't be defined, but it's a very broad distinction, broad and vague distinction that I have in mind between, on the one hand, on the mathematical side, notions of endlessness and boundlessness and unsurveyability, and then on the metaphysical side, notions of completeness and perfection and value. And what I'm thinking of as the metaphysical conception of the infinite is the kind of conception that you might be more likely to find at work in the writings of theologians as opposed to mathematicians. Now, So in particular, I think I would want to disagree with Nansing about some of the things that you said about infinite divisibility. I mean, it is true that when you're thinking about infinite divisibility, questions about infinite divisibility, and in particular, perhaps when you're thinking about those questions in connection with Leibniz, it is true that you're thinking about metaphysical issues. I certainly wouldn't want to deny that. But I think I would want to deny that the sheer fact that you were thinking about the infinite and the sheer fact that you were thinking about it in a metaphysical context meant that you were thinking about the metaphysically infinite. Those are applications, it seems to me, of the mathematical conception of the infinite. It's notions of endlessness and unlimitedness that are coming into play there. But I do think that we find this distinction at work in various philosophers, and I do think that we find it at work in Kant. And I am still inclined to think that there's a sense of infinite value at work in Kant attaching to each human being. Now, Nansing, you wanted to challenge that, and you said, well, actually, what we find in Kant is talk of unqualified value, or perhaps unconditioned value. And I think my response to that is, well, yes and no. no, if what you mean is that we never hear Kant using the language of infinity in this connection, because I think we do find that in the famous quotation at the end of the Critique of Practical Reason that I read out earlier in the lecture. But in any case, even if all we had was talk of the unqualified or the unconditioned, that would be good enough for my purposes, because that would be part of this cluster of ideas that go to make up what I'm calling the metaphysical conception of the infinite. The unconditioned is one of the notions that's part of that family of notions that make up that broad conception. And I think that Kant thinks that there's some such notion at work when it comes to thinking about things in themselves, reality as it is in itself, as opposed to the world of appearances, the world of space and time. Now, this conveniently, I think, takes us to Han Linhu's question, which is, what about the world as a whole, the physical world as a whole? What exactly am I wanting to say about that? Am I suggesting that Kant thinks it's metaphysically infinite? Am I suggesting that Kant thinks it's metaphysically infinite? What exactly am I suggesting? Well, of course, what Kant wants to say about the physical world as an unconditioned whole is that there's no such thing. I mean, that's the lesson of the antinomies. That's the conclusion that he wants to draw, and that's one of the things that he thinks helps to give him an indirect argument in favor of transcendental idealism. We think we can talk in those terms. We think we can raise questions about the universe, the physical universe as an unconditioned whole. In fact, we can't. In fact, the arguments in the antinomies show that we can't. And the reason that we can't is precisely that we're sort of conflating different things. I mean, in a way, what it is it's an illegitimate application of the notion of metaphysical infinitude to physical reality. That's already putting us in trouble. That's the reason that we get into the quandaries that we get into in the antinomies. So if you're, as it were, confused about what exactly I think about the relationship between the world as an unconditioned whole and these notions of metaphysical and mathematical infinity, then my answer is, well, yes, there's confusion here. And I think Kant thinks there's confusion here. I think that's Kant's diagnosis of the problem. We're sort of applying the notion of the metaphysically infinite in a way in which we can't. When it comes to physical reality, the only legitimate applications of the notion of infinity are applications of the mathematical notion of infinity. That would be my story about what's going on there. So, I mean, we can continue the conversation if there's time, but perhaps I'll stop at that point.
Thank you so much. I do think that if we can agree to take a few more minutes after the hour today, as we have done before, then I would welcome any short responses by Professor Nan or Professor Han, either now or later. But if you do not want to respond now, then we can hear from our two other panelists. Okay, good. So let me introduce two more of our four panelists tonight. I will start with Li Qilin, simply in alphabetical order, because I do not remember whether we said that we were going to do it one way or the other. Li Xilin is associate professor in philosophy at Peking University. He obtained his doctorate from McMaster University in 2013 and joined Peking University in spring of that same year. He works mainly in epistemology and philosophy of language, and he's also interested in philosophy of mind and metaphysics. Earlier this year, he published a book on contextualism in epistemology with Peking University Press. Welcome, Professor Li. Professor Zhao You is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, also at Peking University. Her research and teaching are mainly in the transmission of Buddhism from India to China and early Indian metaphysics and linguistic philosophy. She is currently leading a project on the philosophy of time in Indian philosophy funded by the Chinese National Social Science Fund. One of her recent publications in this connection include, for example, an article entitled Time in Early Indian Philosophy from Panjali to Bhattari. I mispronounced that badly, I'm sorry about that. That was published in the Chinese Journal of Foreign Philosophy. She's also translator of the impact of Buddhism on Chinese material culture by Stanford Professor of Buddhist Studies, John Kieschnick. Okay, welcome, Professor Zhao. Now, whoever wishes to start can simply do so by opening the microphone, holding up your hand to show the rest of us that you do wish to start. Anyone?
All right. Since
Okay,
you
yeah,
mentioned,
thank
we talk that first. First of all, I want to thank Professor Moore for wonderful and inspiring talk and the infinity for this 4 times. And for me, today I will raise certain kind of question concerning certain kind of philosophical, epistemological or metaphysical applications concerning the infinity in the thought experiment. It's very interesting that you quote a certain kind of paragraph or sentence from George Berkeley concerning there's no such thing like 1,000th of 1 inch, and we have certain kind of counterpart in Chinese philosophy, like in Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi report a certain kind of ancient logician and orator who also use this kind of thought experiments. This ancient logician mentioned that when we talk about infinity, or when we imagine those kind of infinity, we can do certain kind of thought experiment, like we can take a stick with 1 foot long, and for each day we cut that stick into 2 halves, and through one part and hold the other part. And for next day we can cut that into 2 halves as well. Then go on for thousands years without any end. And I think from the interpretation or conceptual framework you provide is more like certain kind of mathematical concept of infinity, because it comes with endless. But from my point of view, I think for if we take a more charitable interpretation concerning this kind of ancient logician's view, it seems that they want to do certain kind of thought experiments, try to join certain kind of conclusion for metaphysical conclusion, like how the infinity could be metaphysically possible, how we can get some idea concerning the infinity in the metaphysical world, something like that. And by the way, it's very interesting that actually, I think Zhuangzi may share a certain kind of view, agree with Berkeley in some sense, because Zhuangzi thought, well, that kind of argumentation is really paradoxical, so we can just reject all of them. But take Huishi's view seriously. It seems that it depends on how we imagine this kind of, or how we apply the concept into this kind of thought experiment or thought object. Like we do the first part of the thought experiment, those kind of description is kind of concrete operation that a human being can do. We have the concrete stick, you can cut that in 2 halves, then we can repeat those kind of things in our mind, then repeatedly repeat those kind of things endlessly. Though by this kind of way, we can grasp the metaphysical, or at least according to Hui Shi, the Asian logician, we grasp this kind of metaphysical conception of infinity. And also, if we take this kind of route to apply the concept of infinity into, say, the God, we can also transform the God, like from the metaphysical concept of God, which relates more significantly with the perfectness, perfectness, benevolence, or all of kinds of big word. We can also say the God is kind of infinite being because they never has any starting point in temporal process, and there's no end. In that case, it seems that even for God, we can talk about the endless of God's precise being in this case. So it seems that when we do this kind of thought experiment, we can use the concept in either way. And I want to know more about your idea concerning what kind of lessons that we could draw from this kind of comparison when we do the thought experiments related to the concept of infinity. Whether they got certain kind of dangers, we can sometimes we slip our in the reason of the thought experiments, we slip mistakenly from the metaphysical to the mathematical conception, or misuse those kind of concepts, misinterpret our conclusions by using those kind of thought experiments. So that basically is my concern about how to apply the metaphysical and the mathematical conception of the infinity in our thought experiments, and how this kind of thing sort of influence upon our metaphysical consideration in philosophy in general. So that's my question. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Professor Li. Now is Professor Zhao Tan.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for a very kind introduction. And thank you very much, Professor Moore, for this wonderful lecture. There's so much to think along with all those topics and quotations, especially because they are quite relevant to theological thinking. And I find today's talk quite familiar in a sense, because we start from the finitude to the infinite. And you probably know that Sanskrit philosophers, they usually start a discussion with an analysis of the word itself. So to talk about the infinite or infinity would start with what is the infinite, and what is this negation or negative particle or negative prefix mean. So I had this question in mind, what kind of negation it is in this simple word infinity, or in Greek perils. I'm not sure if I pronounced correctly, but I realized that there may be some difficulty to like really approach these words from the angle I'm used to, like in the Sanskrit tradition. So I kind of have other two questions relevant, but more closely connected to two of your quotations. One is from Kant. So because he mentioned if the word is a whole existing in itself, it is either finite or infinite. It struck me because we in Indian philosophy have four corners of the logic possibilities, and I think you mentioned these dialectism in your book in the revised version. So I'm wondering, just it's a naive question, so whether it is possible to have something that is both finite and infinite, because it is possible in Indian tradition. And the second question is relevant to one of the very earliest quotation from Descartes, because he used this verb grasp. To grasp something is to embrace it in one's thought. And if we think about infinity, or we think about the mind activity to understand infinity as to grasp, it looks like very strange or curious for me, because in the Buddhist tradition, we would say that even if you think you grasp the infinite, that is not the infinite actually. So is it possible that infinity, always this negative sense, it is actually a different kind of cognitive process instead of grasp? Instead of grasping, it is rather releasing something. Is it possible, or if there is any philosophers in the West would think in this way? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both of you. These are some more excellent questions, and actually there's a connection with the two previous questions, because the idea of the metaphysically infinite and the mathematically infinite has surfaced again. So last time I went in reverse order, but this time I think I'll look at the questions in the same order that they arose. So first of all, Li Qilin was raising some questions about thought experiments and what kind of access they give us to the infinite. We have the idea, for example, of being able to cut a physical object up into pieces that are smaller and smaller. You may have a stick which you divide in half, and then each half can in turn be divided in half, and so on. There was this quotation from Berkeley, which you picked up on. He was prepared to say that eventually you won't be able to cut any longer. And that's a very extreme view, but not many people have agreed with him. And most people are prepared to say, well, at least in principle, you can keep cutting forever. And it just seems to be a simple thought experiment to show that you can do that. Now, my own view about this kind of experiment is actually rather Wittgensteinian. I mean, there's quite a lot in Wittgenstein that I would want to agree with. And I think I would want to take a Wittgensteinian view about what's going on here. I myself, when I was just describing the thought experiment, used the phrase "and so on." And as we saw in the lecture, that was something that Wittgenstein picked up on. And he was keen to emphasize that this phrase has a perfectly straightforward, perfectly unmysterious use. And I think what these thought experiments are doing in a way is tapping into that very straightforward, very unmysterious use. If you've got a physical object in front of you, then in principle, you can cut it into two smaller pieces, and you can cut each of those pieces into two smaller pieces, and so on. And then what Wittgenstein would want to say is that if you think about how the phrase is used, and if you think about its application in a case like this, then what you come to appreciate is you come to appreciate the grammar of the phrase. And it is partly a matter of what you think makes sense and what you think doesn't make sense. And in a way, what Wittgenstein is doing here is disagreeing with Berkeley about whether it really even makes sense to say that you've reached the point that you can't keep going any longer. It's part of the very grammar of the phrase "and so on" that you always can keep going. And this is part of our fundamental understanding of the mathematically infinite. Now, does it give us a grasp of the metaphysically infinite? That's the point at which I'm inclined to be more skeptical. And I mean, quite what Wittgenstein would say about that question is a further matter. But that's the point at which I'm inclined to be skeptical and inclined to think that we don't really have a proper understanding of the metaphysically infinite. Now, this very conveniently brings us to Zhao Yu's question. And I totally agree with you. I mean, you talked about how Sanskrit thinkers often begin by reflecting on the use of language. And actually, of course, that's a very Wittgensteinian thing to do as well. But I totally agree with you that it's a very pertinent and helpful thing to do in a context like this. And in particular, of course, the question arises, well, can we understand the infinite just by thinking about the infinite and just by thinking about what happens if you put negation in front of it? Now, one of the lessons that I think we have to learn from Wittgenstein is that it's not always as simple as that. So Wittgenstein has a famous example, which is completely unrelated, but nevertheless makes a similar point. So Wittgenstein asks us to imagine somebody who says it's 5 o'clock on the sun. And we say, what on earth are you talking about? What do you mean it's 5 o'clock on the sun? What, that doesn't make any kind of sense. And then the person replies, well, you know what 5 o'clock means, don't you? And we say, well, yes, we know what 5 o'clock means. And they say, well, you know what on the sun means? And we say, well, yes, we know what on the sun means. And they say, well, I'm just putting those two bits together. But of course, that doesn't help. I mean, just because you know what the constituents mean, it doesn't follow that you're going to have a good grasp of what happens when you put them together. Now, if somebody came along and said, I'm talking about the infinite, and we said, well, hold on, I'm not quite sure what you mean. What do you understand by the infinite? And they say, well, look, you know what the finite means, don't you? And they say, and we say, yes. And then they say, well, you know what negation is, don't you? And we say, well, yes. And they say, well, I'm just putting those two things together. And it's not necessarily going to help. I mean, it may help, but it may not. And in a way, I think that what troubles me as much as anything is a word that's very much part of English discussions of these issues. And it may be that, it may be that I'm betraying the fact that I am an English speaker and that I think about these issues in terms of the English language. Because this is something that's not going to appear in other languages. But really, what worries me about the infinite is the word the infinite. Now, that's something which I know isn't going to translate over into other languages. And people that speak languages that don't have the definite article, the word the in it, often do find it very difficult to grasp the idea. And English speakers find it very difficult to explain the idea to non-native English speakers. You know, when is it appropriate to use the word the? And when is it appropriate to use the word a? And this is a very difficult question, but one thing that it seems to be doing in this context is that it seems to be suggesting that idea of a whole, something that can be grouped together into one single entity, the infinite, the sort of expression that English speakers might use if they're talking about God. And one of the notions that's at work here is the notion of unity, the notion of everything bound together in a unified, complete whole. And that's part of what's troubling, I think. And that's part of what we can't get at just by negating our idea of the finite. But if we are thinking in terms of negation, ordinary negation, then there are some fascinating questions that arise, which you raised, about things like the law of excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction. We found Kant raising the question whether the physical universe is finite or infinite. Now, he was prepared to say neither, and that wasn't because he denied the law of the excluded middle. It was because he thought there was a clear third alternative, which is that the universe doesn't exist at all. So it's a little bit like saying that the King of France is neither bald nor hairy. That's okay because there's no such person as the King of France. So Kant is not denying the law of the excluded middle, and I suggested that we could make good sense of what Kant was doing there. But you raised a very different question, which is, what about somebody who comes along and says that the answer is both? And in the Western tradition, this is a view that has recently become associated with Graham Priest, who is somebody who does argue that there can be true contradictions. And Graham Priest is very familiar with Eastern thought, with Buddhist thought, and that's part of what motivates him to take this view. Now, it's a huge question. I wish we had much, much more time. I think it's a fascinating question. I mean, all I can say, which is not very helpful, I'm afraid, is that I am unsympathetic to what Graham Priest has to say about this. I don't myself believe that there can be true contradictions. I don't think that it's ever appropriate to say P and not P. But obviously, I mean, so I'm just stating that, I'm not arguing for it. And obviously that does fly in the face of a lot of really interesting thought, including a lot of really interesting Eastern thought. But I would qualify my answer by saying that although I'm unsympathetic to the idea that there can be true contradictions, I'm not unsympathetic to the idea that you might sometimes want to say something and say the opposite of that thing, or that there might be occasions where it seems appropriate to say P and not P. Or actually, as something even stronger than that, there are situations in which it is appropriate to say P and not P. And the way I would try to explain that, while continuing to insist on the law of the excluded middle, is that I think that what's going on there is that this shows that there's a kind of flexibility in the use of the word not, and that this goes to show that somebody is using the word not in a way that doesn't directly correspond to what I have in mind when I talk about the law of non-contradiction. But I know that Graham Priest would vehemently disagree with me about that. And he would say, no, this is ordinary, straightforward negation. And so there's obviously still a big debate to be had about that. But you did raise one other final question, which is a question about our grasp of the infinite. And that was the thing that I focused on right at the end of my lecture. And in a way, I think that was a really interesting question that you raised. And in a way, it gets right to the heart of the matter, because I suppose if I was going to give you a very crude summary of my own view about the metaphysically infinite. Partly what I think is that one of the concepts that makes up the cluster of concepts that we associate with the metaphysically infinite would be the concept of the ungraspable. And so, you know, as it were, almost by definition, we can't grasp it. I mean, anything that we can grasp is finite. So, I mean, if you think about Descartes' mountain analogy, if you can get your arms around something, then it's finite. If you can embrace something, then that goes to show that it's got limits. You know, it's got whatever limits it needs to have for you to be able to put your arms around it. Now, of course, that's only a metaphor, but the same sort of thing applies. If you can get your mind around it, then it's finite. If you can grasp it, then it's finite. The infinite is ungraspable. That's part of the very notion of infinity. So I like Descartes' analogy. I like the idea that we can touch it but can't grasp it. You know, we can sort of have these thoughts. We can have thoughts about what we can't grasp. We can touch what we can't get our arms around. But what we have to conclude, I think, is the kind of thing that Iris Murdoch concluded, which is that we also have to say there's no such thing, because existence itself ends up being a kind of limitation. So there's this famous tradition in philosophy of arguing for the existence of God on ontological grounds. People talk about the ontological argument for the existence of God. And what they have in mind is the idea that God is so perfect that he must exist because existence is a perfection. And you find that argument in Descartes as well as the one that we consider today. And it's as if Iris Murdoch is completely turning the tables and saying, look, I've got an ontological argument for the non-existence of God. This is the exact opposite argument. I want to say that existence is an imperfection. Previous thinkers have wanted to say that existence is a perfection that God must have. Murdoch says, no, any being that exists, I mean, that's already a kind of imperfection. You know, mere existence is not good enough for God. Existence is an imperfection that God can't have. So you've got a kind of ontological argument for the non-existence of God. And that's why that quotation from Murdoch is such an interesting and fascinating one, I think.
Thank you so much, Adrian, and thanks to all of our panelists for your wonderful comments. Now, we have already gone slightly over time, but I do think that we should take at least one of the questions that we received from our audience. I can also say that many of those that I now do not have time to read out have been answered in some way or other already. But there's one which I think may be answered relatively briefly, and I think Adrian may use it for his last word of the day. And this question is this. The question is, we can think of our human finitude as either a lack of something or the privation of something, or we can think of it as our essence. And now the question is, which way of thinking about it is better? It's a difficult question.
Yes, a very difficult question, a very good question. It's it's sort of been answered in things that I've said earlier, in as much as I did want to say that I took the opposite view from Descartes. Descartes thought that our idea of the infinite was basic and that we arrived at our idea of the finite by negating it. And I don't want to say that. If thinking of our finitude as a kind of lack meant agreeing with Descartes, then that's not what I would want to say. So when we reflect on our finitude, I don't think what we're reflecting on is the fact that we're not infinite, where the infinite is thought of as something basic. But there is another sense in which we are reflecting on the fact that we're lacking. I mean, a very simple, very straightforward sense in which that's what we're doing. So the fact that we're spatially finite, for example, is reflected in the fact that we lack existence in portions of space that are out there. I mean, here I am with a particular body taking up a particular portion of space, and I'm surrounded by physical entities that are not part of me, that are occupying the space outside me. And I lack existence in those portions of space. So there is a sense in which our finitude is a matter of what we lack. But the question was, are we supposed to think of our infinitude in terms of what we lack, or are we supposed to think of it as our essence? And you're right, that does give me a nice way of sort of summarizing today's discussion, because I think my answer is both. That is to say, this is part of our essence. We are essentially finite beings, finite in all sorts of ways, spatially, temporally, and in other ways. We essentially lack in various ways. So my answer to that question would be both.
Thank you so much, Adrian. And that concludes today's meeting, since we have already gone over time. And I think we've had a wonderful discussion. Since this concludes our meeting today, it also is the conclusion of this series of meetings, this series of 4 lectures with discussion on the history of the infinite. So it remains to be said that it was just wonderful, Adrian, and I want to thank you again for all of your lectures and great discussions. Many thanks indeed, and I want to thank all of the panelists also who have made the discussion so very interesting over the course of these meetings. And I want to thank especially our panelists today, of course, for another great discussion. Thank you so much. So thanks, everyone. Thanks to our audience too. And goodbye until soon.
Can I just finally add my own thanks? I mean, it was very kind of you to invite me to give these lectures. I'm grateful to you, Sebastian, and I'm grateful to the institutions and all the panelists that have asked such great questions as well.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you.
Right. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Hi.